ている、ていく、てくる、ては、ても. What if I told you that all these points don't actually exist and don't need to be studied separately as long as you understand the core concepts of the te form? Let's begin.
Jouzu, Jouzu.
First, let's dive into te iru as this is one of the most commonly used grammar points. What this really is the te form plus the verb iru. The te form, as we've covered in the previous video, links things together. But what does iru do? Iru is a normal ichidan verb that means something exists and is sentient. If you do not know what an ichidan verb is, please watch this video on the top right first as it explains how Japanese people categorize verbs. We can use iru in a regular sentence like inu ga iru. This is a complete logical clause that means dog does exist. And this would be said in, for example, if my friend and I were walking down the road and I see a dog, I can be like, oh, there's a dog. Ah, inu ga iru.
What the dog doing?
Alright, now put that aside for a second and think about this. In English, when have you ever said anything like, I watch TV, or I eat, or I come? Probably not very often. That's because we say, I'm watching TV, or I'm eating, or I'm coming. In Japanese, it's quite similar. For example, テレビを見ている. What we've done is attach いる after the te form of 見る to see. So, exist see or exist in a state of see. So if you currently see, you are seeing. In other words, seeing TV or watching TV. This is why in Japanese, it is called the 現在進行形, currently progressing form. As you can see, this is quite similar to English's ing. You can either walk, 歩く, or exist in a state of walk, 歩いている. Now, some people might say, but Chafe, why are you complicating this so much? Why not just straight up say, ている is ing? Well, because it's not. To understand this, let's look at two examples. Number one, every morning I have these clan battles on this game with my Japanese friends. Sometimes I can't join because I'm busy editing videos, like this one. My friends could ask, あれ、Chafe-san まだ寝ている? Chafe-san still in the state of sleep? Question? And I can respond with, いや、起きているよ. 起きる means to wake up. So, 起きている would be waking up, right? Not exactly. What I'm really saying here is I'm currently awake, because exist in the state of wake up is to both be awake and to be in the act of waking up. English's I'm waking up does not convey both meanings. 2. Since iru is just a regular ichidan verb, we can apply regular ichidan conjugations. If I wanted to change this into past tense, I'd do what I mentioned in the previous video and change the る into a た. テレビを見ていた existed in a state of watch TV. We can't do this in natural English. We can be watching TV or could have watched TV, but we can't watching TV. But what about I was watching TV then? The problem here is that this is a is B sentence, while テレビを見ていた is an A does be sentence. If you start flipping nouns with verbs and verbs with nouns, it's no wonder Japanese feels confusing. So if you're unfamiliar with the only two types of sentences in Japanese, please watch this video on the top right first. Alright, next, I want to reinforce that いる is just a regular verb. So what do I do to combine 雨が降っている rain exists in the state of fall with 公園に行けない is not able to go to the park? Feel free to pause if you need to. 雨が降っていて公園に行けない. To connect two clauses, we change the first engine into its te form. In this case, it is いる. And since いる is an ichidan verb, we swap the る with a te. So as you can see, the function of the te form stays consistent even in these situations. In other words, this grammar point doesn't actually exist and is just a combination of two simpler elements. Moving on, let's look at ていく and てくる. Try to recall the verbs 行く and 来るwhile we jump into the first example sentence by my teacher, the late Cure Dolly sensei. ペンを持っている. 持つ is a verb meaning to hold or to carry or to have in possession. So exist in a state of have pen. Now, if the pen is over there, I'd have to take the pen and come back. I would say ペンを持ってくる. Take the pen and come. Conversely, we can also say ペンを持っていく. Take the pen and go somewhere else. And a fun thing you can do is put 行く and 来る together and you get 行ってくる, commonly said as
行ってきます.
Japanese people say this when they leave their house, and it means go and come, as in go somewhere else and then come back. Now, we can also use these more metaphorically. So let's take a look at our base sentence. 雨が降っている. Rain does exist in the state of fall. Alright, so what about 雨が降ってくる? Take a second to see if you can figure out what's going on here. Again, feel free to pause if you need to. Okay, so this would be rain, fall, come. Rain, ame, is the subject marked ga, and it does the main action, kuru, fall. So, rain falls. And it also comes. In English, we could say something similar like, the rain has come. Don't treat this English literally, I'm just pointing out that we can also use come in this way. Conversely, let's now consider 雨が降っていく. If you instinctively guessed rain, fall, go, as in the rain is falling and going somewhere else, half correct. Remember that I mentioned we're looking at more metaphorical uses. The answer is that the rain is going, but it's not going anywhere. How can we go without going somewhere? Well, going forward, I'll be explaining this point. Hey look, I didn't go anywhere physically, but we went forward in time together. In other words, rain is falling now, and it will continue to fall as we go forward in time. We may say something similar in English like, the rain keeps going. Again, do not treat this English literally. The point is to show that we can use go in this way in English as well. Next, let's take a look at tewa and temo. But first, we're gonna need to understand the wa and mo topic marking particles. I will make a video in the future covering every single particle in detail, and that'll be linked up here when it comes out. But for now, I'm gonna give a quick summary. Both the wa and mo particles are topic marking particles. The difference is that wa is exclusive and mo is inclusive. For example, パンは食べた. As for bread, ate. Because I specified bread as the exclusive topic, it implies that bread is the only thing I ate and nothing else. While パンは食べなかった means as for bread was not eat. This implies that bread is the only thing I didn't eat and I could have eaten something else. On the other hand, パンも食べた as for bread, ate too. In this case, bread is the inclusive topic. It implies that bread is included among other things that I ate. While パンも食べなかった as for bread was not eat too implies that I didn't eat anything, not even bread. Okay, not that hard by itself, but put it behind the te form and all of a sudden, it's a brand new grammar point. But let me ask you this, what do you think is gonna happen? Is it going to A. Completely change function into something unrecognizable, B. Completely lose all function and become a meaningless sound, or C. Completely remain unchanged and do exactly what we expect it to do? Well, textbooks and grammar guides are gonna tell you it's either A or B, but the reality is, you already know it. It's C. Let's start with this base sentence. 雨が降って公園に行けない. Rain does fall, is not able to go to the park. But what happens when we do 雨が降っては公園に行けない? Well, since wa is the exclusive topic marker, rain does fall becomes the exclusive topic. As for rain does fall, is not able to go to the park, meaning that the reason we could not go to the park is just because of the darn rain. On the other hand, 雨が降っても公園に行く. Even though rain does fall, go to the park. The inclusive topic marker mo makes rain does fall included among other things that influence the result, go to park. By the way, we can do this for non-verb ending sentences too. For example, 猿でもわかる, which often gets translated to even monkeys understand. What this actually is 猿だ is a monkey plus the mo particle plus the verb わかる makes sense. By adding the mo particle, we are saying that even for monkeys, among other things, it makes sense. And you might also realize now that this right here, demo, looks very similar to demo meaning but, and that's because that's where it comes from. Now, that's a pretty big bombshell, but I'm just getting started. Here is my artillery. About 60% of all Japanese grammar points follow the same pattern and technically don't exist. They are essentially just simple concepts bundled together and presented as new. 手ある、手置く、手見る、手から、手もいい. This list can quite literally go on infinitely. But you don't need to learn any of these separately as long as you understand the te form plus whatever particle or whatever word they're using. I'm not saying that if you understand the te form, you should never look up teiru, and that if you do, senpai will be ashamed of you because you did not truly understand the te form. I'm just saying, you wouldn't have to do this because it'd be possible for you to figure it out yourself. And if you did look it up, you would understand much deeper than anybody else why it does what it does. Case in point, something like te ite wa. It's made up of the te form plus iru, plus the te form again, and then the particle wa. If you understand all of these core elements, you do not need to learn this as a separate point. But Chafe, you just turned 1 point into 3 elements. How's this simpler? Sure, if you isolate this one case, 1 to 3 might sound like a deficit. But what about 10 bloated points to 3 core principles? Or 20, or 50, or even 100? See, this approach helps you understand an infinite amount of combinations from a finite set of principles. One thing I want to clarify is that I'm not saying that just because you can break something down, you must and you should. Some things can be understood immediately. Some things you get no extra value out of breaking down. Some things worked naturally 300 years ago, but not anymore. And some things are hotly debated by linguists who struggle to explain it as well. But how can you tell whether something can be broken down or should be broken down in the first place? Well, in the description, I will provide a link to a free document listing out every single common grammar point and what it breaks down to. Patrons and YouTube members at the Kanbu tier or above will also get access to direct links to learn each of these elements.
But wait, there's more.
You can unlock access to the worksheet for this video where I also explain a very difficult point in when to use naide versus nakute. So to unlock all of this and every worksheet that I've ever made, consider supporting me on Patreon using the link in the top right or pressing the join button below. Moving on from these grammar patterns, I want to talk about the similarities between the te form and the e stem that I covered in the previous video on verb stems. Simply put, the e stem is just te form plus. We can explore their similarities and differences using 4 points. 1. The te form can take normal words, but it can't take standalone helper verbs and helper adjectives. For example, we can say 振って回す, 振る meaning to shake, and 回す meaning to spin something. 回す is just a normal verb. So this just means to shake and spin something around as two separate verbs. But if we wanted to attach tai, we would have to say furitai, because tai is a dedicated helper adjective that can only attach to the e stem. 2. When the e stem connects, it can create a single compound word. So while 振って回す is two verbs, 振り回す is considered one single compound verb. When you do this, it can come with extended metaphorical meanings. So alongside simply waving and spinning something around, it can also mean to flex on people, as if waving and swinging around your skills. 3. A verb in its e stem can turn into a noun. For example, 明日は休みだ. As for tomorrow is a rest. Yasumi, the e stem of the verb yasumu, meaning to rest. As you can see, this sentence ends on noun plus copula. What we can't do is 明日は休んでだ. This is just incorrect. 4. Both the te form and the e stem can connect multiple clauses. If we bring back our first example sentence ever, スーパーに行ってパンを買った, we can actually replace the te form with the e stem and it will still work. スーパーに行きパンを買った. Meaning-wise, these are virtually identical, only the te form is simply more common. Next, you may have encountered certain sentences that end on a te, like 待って, meaning wait.
待って!
This is essentially a request for a certain action, in this case, requesting someone to wait. What's actually going on here is that the request part of it is being contracted. Some people will say that ください is getting skipped, as in 待ってください. But this is not the only possibility. 待ってくれ is also possible, and so is 待ってなさい. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter which it is because we can't read people's minds. Or at least, I can't. The important part is that for verbs, it's typically a request that's being contracted. But what about for A is B sentences? Well, if I had 10 cats and someone asked me why I have so many cats, I could say, まあ、猫が好きなんで. Which means, well, cats are likable, so... The so what is not mentioned because I didn't feel like I had to. From the question I received, it should be obvious to both parties what I did or what I felt after. By the way, if you're curious as to what this nde is, this is another bloated point that I broke down in this video in the top right. We're not done with verbs yet, as there's still one final factor you must know. Tadoushi and jidoshi are what you must understand to tell the difference between verbs like hajimeru and hajimaru, start and start? So click here to watch the next video about tadoushi and jidoshi.